When 16-year-old Mark Williams was arrested just for walking home, his father, the Attorney General, realized it was time to challenge the system. Their struggle would uncover truths that would shake the entire city. My decision will surprise even the most seasoned among you. But let's start from the beginning. Mark quickened his pace, turning into a dark alleyway that was the quickest route to his house. In the distance, he saw the flashing lights of police cars, and his heart sank as one car abruptly stopped and another patrol vehicle cut him off from the opposite side. The street was deserted, and Mark found himself surrounded. "Hey! Stop! Hands up!" an officer commanded, stepping out of his car with a flashlight aimed directly at Mark's eyes. Mark froze, instinctively raising his hands, his voice trembling as he tried to explain. "Officer, I'm just heading home from practice. My gym clothes and books, they're in my backpack right here." He nodded toward his backpack. "Drop the backpack on the ground," the officer demanded forcefully, keeping his gaze on Mark as though he were facing a hardened criminal. Mark slowly placed the backpack on the asphalt, lifting his hands. The officer's stare was cold and unyielding. A second officer came up from behind, seizing Mark's wrists and quickly pulling his hands behind his back. "What did I do?" Mark tried to turn, but the metal handcuffs had already clicked shut around his wrists. "We'll find out what you did at the station," the officer said, gesturing for his partner to check Mark's backpack. The officer rummaged through it, pulling out school books, a water bottle, and gym clothes, still searching as if looking for something incriminating. Tears began to well in Mark's eyes. He couldn't believe he was being stopped and searched like a criminal, without a chance to explain who he was or why he was there. Meanwhile, people began gathering at nearby doorways. Neighbors and passers-by watched the scene unfold. An elderly woman, a neighbor of Mark's family, called out loudly to the officers, "Leave him alone. He's just a kid. He lives here." "Stand back, ma'am," one of the officers replied sharply. "Don't interfere with our investigation." Mark tried to explain himself again, but the officers were already leading him to the patrol car, treating him as if he were a criminal rather than an innocent teenager. In that moment, Mark felt a crushing loneliness and injustice, his mind filled with only one thought. This just can't be happening. At the station, they seated Mark on a hard chair under harsh lighting, and he watched silently as the officers filled out paperwork, indifferent to him or his side of the story. Time seemed to stretch endlessly, and finally, overwhelmed with anger and anxiety, he made his request. "I want to call my dad," Mark said quietly but firmly. The officer at the desk gave him an irritated look. "Your dad can't help you, kid. Just sit there and wait." Holding back his frustration, Mark knew they hadn't even tried to understand. Meanwhile, his father, James Williams, was finishing up an important meeting and, glancing at his phone, noticed several missed calls from neighbors and an alarming message. "James, it looks like your son's been arrested." Instantly grasping the severity of the situation, James rushed out, heading straight for the police station. Upon arrival, he entered the building with a face set in determination and barely restrained fury. Presenting his ID, he demanded in a loud, commanding voice to be allowed immediate access to the detained minor. The secretary at the front desk, recognizing his name and position, grew visibly nervous and tried to explain. "Mr. Williams, this is standard procedure. We had no idea this involved your son." "Whether he's my son or not, you're obligated to follow the law and respect his rights," James interrupted sharply, insisting they bring him to Mark at once. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, realizing they were losing control of the situation, and reluctantly led James to the interrogation room. There he found his son, tired, head bowed, but with hope and relief in his eyes upon seeing his father. James immediately addressed the officers, his gaze filled with barely contained rage. "Explain to me, on what grounds did you arrest him?" The officer stammered, mumbling about suspicion and standard procedures, but James gave them no opportunity to justify themselves. "Suspicion? Based on what? His skin color?" James stepped forward, raising his voice. "You have no idea what your actions represent or how they reveal systemic bias." Just then, the shift supervisor entered the room, recognizing the mistake that had been made and attempting to defuse the situation. But James cut him off before he could say a word. "Tomorrow, you'll explain in a press conference how you violated my son's rights." James and Mark began making their way down the empty corridor of the police station, their footsteps echoing through the quiet hall. But before they could reach the door, Captain Stevens, a tall, gray-haired supervisor with a stern but slightly uneasy expression, blocked their path. "Mr. Williams, please, let's discuss this calmly," the captain said, trying to regain control. "This was a misunderstanding. We were only following standard procedures." James, without breaking eye contact, replied with measured firmness. "A misunderstanding. My son was detained, searched, had his backpack ripped from him, and was handcuffed. All without evidence and without a call to me. How do you explain that?" Captain Stevens lowered his gaze, searching for the right words, but James, unwilling to wait for an answer, continued. "Your procedures are rooted in prejudice, Captain. Tell me, would you have acted the same way if my son were a white teenager? This isn't the first time in our area that black individuals have been unjustly detained, and I will no longer allow it." The gathered officers, the desk clerk, and even a few bystanders nearby were now listening intently. At this point, a young officer tried to defend himself. "We were just following orders, sir. The boy fit the description of a suspect." James cast a cold, anger-filled look in his direction. "Following orders? Blindly following orders is no excuse for mistreating innocent people. Did it never cross your mind that your suspect might just be a regular high school student? Have you ever thought about what it's like to fear stepping outside, knowing you could be arrested for no reason?" Captain Stevens attempted to interject again. "Mr. Williams, we had no intention of causing you or your son any inconvenience. We were just doing our job." But James cut him off again, this time raising his voice so everyone around could hear. Your job is to protect and serve, and instead you're targeting innocent people. Tomorrow, I'll hold a press conference and explain how incidents like these disgrace our city's justice system." At that moment, journalists and reporters began gathering outside the station doors, cameras trained on James and Mark, capturing every moment. Seeing them, James seized the opportunity. "I want everyone to know that this is just one of many examples of systemic racism that needs to be eradicated. My son, like any other child, deserves the right to safety and respect," he said, directing his words to the public. Captain Stevens paled, realizing that the situation had spiraled out of control with serious consequences. Meanwhile, Mark, standing beside his father, felt the full weight and strength of his father's words. He sensed the protective power of his father's support encircling him like a shield. In Mark's eyes, there was determination and a sense of purpose to make this situation a turning point, not only for himself, but for others. "Let's go, son," James said gently, putting a hand on his shoulder. "There's nothing more for us here." Mark, feeling confident and protected, nodded, and together they walked out, leaving the stunned officers behind. The next day, a large crowd of journalists, activists, and city residents gathered outside the police station. People held signs reading, "Justice for Mark," and "No racial bias." Cameras and microphones were trained on James Williams, who stood before the crowd with a determined look. Behind him stood Mark, head held high, ready to support his father in the fight for truth. James approached the microphones, speaking clearly and confidently, his voice echoing over the crowd. "Last night, my son, a 16-year-old, was detained without cause. He became a victim of police bias simply because of his skin color. Like any other citizen, Mark deserves safety, but instead he received humiliation." Shouts of support erupted from the crowd, and someone called out, "How much longer will this go on?" James raised his voice, pressing on. "This is not an isolated case. It's a symptom of a deeply rooted problem within the system. This isn't the first time a black teenager in our city has been targeted due to bias. Should this continue? I say, no." The crowd applauded, cheering in agreement. Suddenly, Captain Stevens approached the microphone, attempting to calm the situation politely but tensely. "Mr. Williams, We regret what happened. This was a misunderstanding. Our officers followed standard procedure, not knowing your son was innocent. James turned to him, his gaze cold and resolute. A misunderstanding? He repeated, restraining his anger. Is that what you call the baseless detention, humiliation, and rights violation of a teenage boy? What standard procedure guided you in detaining a boy carrying nothing but school books? Your actions reflect not the enforcement of order, but prejudice. Captain Stevens tried to respond, but James spoke directly to the crowd. Today, this happened to my son. But tomorrow? Tomorrow it could be someone's brother, a friend, anyone among you. I demand an official investigation and a review of procedures to ensure no citizen is targeted unfairly again. Journalists quickly noted his words, recording every phrase. Reporters asked questions one after another. Mr. Williams, do you believe this problem is systemic? James responded firmly. Yes, this isn't an isolated incident. It's a symptom of a system in need of reform. Police are meant to protect, not persecute for arbitrary reasons. Every word was captured on camera, and the crowd's intensity grew. Someone in the front shouted, "We're with you, James!" The crowd broke into applause, everyone sensing they were part of something bigger. Under pressure, Captain Stevens was forced to apologize publicly to James and Mark. We apologize and promise an internal investigation. Believe us, we never meant to harm you. But the crowd remained restless. Activists called for further action, demanding transparency in the investigation and changes within the department. Seeing the public's power, James realized that this was a pivotal moment for real reforms. Later that day, the police department announced an internal investigation and promised to reassess its practices to minimize the risk of discrimination and abuse of authority. Proposed changes included new cultural sensitivity training and greater transparency in police actions. As the press conference concluded, James and Mark left to loud applause. Mark felt this was more than just his story. He looked at his father with gratitude and pride, realizing the importance of what they had achieved for so many others. You fought for all of us, Dad, Mark said quietly as they walked away from the crowd. James put a hand on his shoulder and replied, I fought for the truth, son, and now we have a chance to change things.